Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, in less than 2 decades, China has borrowed over $150 billion to Africa, surpassing credit provided by the World Bank. I'll be discussing how this relationship is likely to transform in a post-COVID society with Steve Tsang, the director of the School of Oriental and Africa Studies China Institute at the University of London. And Lebanon's economic implosion deepened this week as Moody's Investor Services downgraded the country's issuer rating. Hisham Safiuddin, an assistant professor from King's College, University of London, will be joining me from southern Lebanon with an update on what's happening on the ground. Then later, I'll be speaking about the evolving investor market with Jared and Isabel Alyssa Asher, founders of the Diaspora Angel Network. China may be in the middle of a geopolitical fallout with America and Britain, but Africa remains one of Beijing's most dependable sources of support. In less than 20 years, China has invested $147 billion on the continent across 54 countries, improving power supplies, infrastructure, and building roads, railways and airports. But will the COVID-19 pandemic restructure that relationship? Two-way trade fell 19.3% in the first half of the year to $82.37 billion as coronavirus ravaged economies and cut demand for commodities. And regions in the global north are refocusing their attention on African diplomacy. For more on this, I'm now being joined by Steve Tsang, director of the School of Oriental and Africa Studies China Institute at the University of London. Steve Tsang, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. $147 billion in less than 20 years. That's how much the China has invested in Africa. Do you think we're likely to see a similar amount over the next 2 decades?
I think China will continue to invest in Africa. The scale of the investment, I think, remains to be seen. The reality is that the Chinese economy is slowing. And therefore, the availability of capital may well be a bit tighter moving forward than in the previous decade or so. But on the other hand, we are also seeing a kind of economic decoupling between China and the United States. And the Chinese government may well be looking at the other parts of the world to strengthen its economic partnership. And Africa, I think, will figure highly there.
It's interesting you say that, talking about these mammoth projects. There's a lot of focus at the moment on the Belt and Road Initiative, apparently costing more than $1 trillion, which is an eye-watering sum. Some have even suggested that perhaps this initiative isn't worth the debt.
Well, there are people within China who are skeptical of the Belt and Road Initiative. And the skepticism is also partly because with the economy slowing down and money become a bit tighter even in China, some people are suggesting that perhaps China need to be spending more of that money domestically to support the Chinese economy. But having said all that, the reality is that the Belt and Road Initiative is a flagship policy of Xi Jinping. And as long as Xi Jinping remains leader in China, he will not allow the Belt and Road Initiative to appear as a failure. So perhaps a bit less money, but it will be continued.
You spoke earlier, Steve, about America and, even under Donald Trump, who hasn't actually had a visit to Africa at the moment. In 2018, Washington launched the $50 million Prosper Africa initiative. Soon as Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, got into power, his first international summit was to woo African leaders over at the O2 Arena in southeast London. And the EU have said over the next 7 to 8 years they really want to focus on their African diplomacy. Do you think these regional strategic ties to Africa can counter China's relationship with Africa, or is it too late?
I think we should not be looking at relationship with Africa as a competition with China. I think personally, I think Africa is a very important part of the world that we should be developing and strengthening our relationship with it anyway, I think supporting development in Africa will be beneficial to the United States and to the UK, and indeed for the rest of Europe. So I would hope that we do not put Africa into a situation of having to choose between either China or the West. We should be looking at development of Africa as a global good.
It's interesting you say that, Steve, but, you know, I'm sitting here in the UK. Millions of our viewers are in Nigeria and across Africa. But I've got to tell you, I've had some discussions about China and Africa ties, and there are people within the African diaspora that are suspicious. They are suspicious of the fact that 50 out of 54 African nations have strong ties with China in terms of loans. A lot of the infrastructure is being built by Africa. Some people see this as a new type of colonialism. Do you think it's fair, or that there are valid reasons as to why the diaspora are suspicious?
I think it is very understandable that a lot of the African diaspora are suspicious. I suspect that there may well be people in Africa who are suspicious as well. I think China is behaving in Africa in a very mixed sort of way. There are things that the Chinese government does in Africa which would remind us of what happens when Europe was in Africa at an earlier time in history. I think the fact that the Chinese government is much more focused on working with African governments in African countries rather than working with people in Africa does cause a fair bit of concern for people. And I think they really should focus on working with people and not just working with governments. Development, I think, needs to be with people, not individual leaders and their administrations.
Lastly, Steve, we're running out of time, but I've got to get your comment on this. Do you think COVID and China's geopolitical standoff with the global north at the moment will evolve the Africa-China relationship?
I think in the very immediate term, it probably would strengthen it a bit. Reality is that everybody are short of PPEs and other essential medical equipment to deal with COVID-19. And suddenly we are seeing Europe and America prioritizing their own citizens first. So in the immediate term, we are seeing China being more generous in relative terms than Europe and Americas to some of the African countries. But if we see China itself facing a second wave, that generosity may not continue, and opinions in Africa may well change and may not see China as being as generous as China would like its image to be perceived.
Absolutely. We've still got the second half of the year, haven't we? Steve Tsang, the director of the China Institute at the School of Oriental and Africa Studies, University of London. Thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. The international credit agency Moody's downgraded Lebanon's projected ability to pay back debt to a level indicating probable loss of investment. It's the latest blow to Lebanon's efforts to emerge from its worst economic crisis in decades. Its currency has plummeted against the US dollar, and both unemployment and job losses are surging. There are continued anti-government protests in the country, and Lebanon is now contending with a surge in COVID-19 cases. The Lebanese government is seeking financial help from abroad, but talks with France and the IMF have not yet yielded results. For more on this, I'm now being joined by Hisham Safiuddin, an assistant professor from King's College, University of London. He's in South Lebanon. Hisham Safiuddin, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. It's a pleasure, and you're on the ground, and that's important because, of course, we know when we're talking in Britain about stories that don't necessarily affect them, things can be warped. But I've got to say, on paper, the recent Moody's downgrading seems to have propelled an already really bad situation in Lebanon. Just tell us what exactly is happening there.
The situation is quite bad. Moody's rating is largely concerned with the debt payments and with the financial situation, so it doesn't really capture what's taking place on the ground, and maybe it's more of a forecast for the future. In terms of on the ground, in the cities, particularly in Beirut, the situation is quite bad in the sense that a lot of shops are shut down. There's a high rate of unemployment. There's increased layoffs taking place in the last 2 weeks compared to the past month. There's a shortage of fuel, which is the biggest crisis people are facing, mostly when it comes to energy. So when it comes to powering the electricity stations. So there are large outages taking place across the country. There's also inflation, which means there's a lot of goods that have become extremely expensive. So some of the mainstream media coverage has been a bit apocalyptic. I've been following that. I can't say that we don't see long queues yet at bakeries. We don't see them elsewhere at hospitals. We're not talking about any time soon famine or a full-scale collapse. What we're seeing is a gradual decline in the ability of people to sustain themselves. What we're seeing is heightened anxiety about the future. So on the ground, like I said, in the cities, things are not looking good, but they're still manageable. In the countryside, things are a little bit actually better because people don't have to pay rent. Many of them own their homes. Some of them are increasingly turning to possibility of growing their fields because of the inability to import. So basically, things are not good, but we're not at the precipice yet, as some of these media coverages are reporting. But maybe, unfortunately, we may be getting there at some point.
Clearly, yes, we're used to that reporting, the apocalyptic reporting, especially for a Nigerian channel. I've got to tell you, though, some of the headlines, again, economic mismanagement, corruption, overspending. Some of us have seen that in a lot of governments, but the fallout doesn't appear to be as bad as Lebanon. Why is the Lebanese situation capturing the attention of economists across the world? What's unique about it?
There are two components, I think, that are critical, that are causing this severe type of crisis. So like you mentioned, we do have high levels of corruption. We have high levels of incompetence and nepotism and clientelism. This is, all across the world, I would say. It's even now present in the global north. But what's special about Lebanon is, firstly, its economy is so unbalanced. If you think of the economy as some form of a cycle, and I mean by that like a bicycle or a tricycle with agriculture, industry, and services, Lebanon is like a unicycle. It's so dependent on services, and it's so dependent on the inflow of dollars from abroad that it has a single tire, and that tire is punctured. So because the Lebanese economy doesn't have its own resources to rely on, whether it's food or whether it's actually export, the strongest sector is the banking sector, and that's the sector that's in crisis. So this is why the entire economy is almost composed of the services sector. So this is why the hit was so big. It's kind of like a country that's so dependent on oil, and all of a sudden the oil dries up. So that's the first component. The second component, which is not being highlighted enough in my view in the media, is the impact of the geo-economic war that's taking place in this region concerning first reconstruction in Syria. Lebanon's only open land borders are with Syria. So its lifeline is Syria. And as long as there is a big tussle between China, Russia on one hand, the US and its allies on the second, Lebanon is stuck in the middle. The second is the war over the oil in the East Mediterranean. So one of the few assets that Lebanon has and can make use of is gas in the Mediterranean. But because of Israeli threats on the southern borders, and because of the competition between Turkey and Egypt, we also have a situation that is squeezing Lebanon out of these opportunities. And last but not least, as part of this geopolitical situation, we have continuous and increasing sanctions by the United States that is preventing the inflow of dollars, that is threatening the import of oil from countries like Iran. So even if there's a shortage and we have little dollars to use, we may not be able to use them. So on top of the corruption and mismanagement, we've got a unbalanced economy and a geopolitical war that is further exacerbating the crisis. And I think the last bit is why many people around the world are interested now in what's happening in Lebanon, because it's becoming a bit of a front. It's kind of a side war that is expanding the war and the competition in Syria.
Hisham Safiuddin, an assistant professor at King's College, University of London. Thank you so much for joining us on Channel's Business Global. Coming up on Channel's Business Global, I'll be speaking about the evolving investor market with Jared and Isabel Alyssa Asher, founders of the Diaspora Angel Network. See you after the break. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. In a moment, I'll be speaking with Jared and Isabel Alyssa Asher from the Diaspora Angel Network. But before then, here's some company news for you. The high-end British department store Selfridges is the latest retail chain to announce job cuts in the country. Earlier this week, management told staff it plans to cut 450 jobs, around 14% of its total headcount, as annual sales are set to be significantly less this year due to the pandemic. The Selfridges announcement comes after it emerged the Chancellor is considering a new tax on goods sold online in a bid to save the high street post-coronavirus. Amazon has launched its grocery delivery service across 300 postcodes in London. Amazon Fresh offers same-day or next-day deliveries for shoppers subscribed to Amazon Prime. It has about 10,000 products, including fresh, chilled and frozen food. It comes after figures showed online shopping now accounts for £3 of every £10 spent in the UK, up from £2 before the coronavirus outbreak. Revenue at budget airline Ryanair plunged 95% during the first quarter of the year as it reported a first quarter loss of €185 million compared to net profit of €243 million during the same period last year. The airline, in a quarterly update, said the period had been the most challenging in its 35-year history. The coronavirus pandemic grounded the group's fleet for almost 4 months, from mid-March to the end of June, as EU governments imposed flight or travel bans and widespread population lockdowns. Now over to our next discussion. Venture capital investment in UK fintech firms has slumped by nearly 40% in the first half of this year, with investors largely using their cash to fund well-established firms amid the coronavirus crisis. Despite the slump from some revenue sources, the investment market is still an attractive destination for high net worth individuals. And two of them join me now. Jared and Isabel Alyssa Asher are the husband and wife founders of the Diaspora Angels Network, providing capital to early-stage post-revenue startups that are unlocking value for Africans in Africa. Jared and Isabel Alyssa Asher, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. I think you're the first husband and wife to join me on the show, so I'm very fortunate to have you. Investment has evolved so much over the years. You're angel investors. How does that differ from venture capitalists and the other ways you can source funding for a startup?
Thanks for having us. When you think about angel investing or investments, actually, as you say, usually what I think of is the fund chain, akin to the food chain. And on that chain, there are numerous players at different points. Angel investors are usually one of the very first to get involved in any startup, after the family and friends, obviously, who generally put in their money first. Angel investors are the ones that come in first, venture capitalists then come in after that, and then subsequently, if the startup does very well, then you're looking at either IPO or you're looking at a PE firm coming in. Now, at those different stages, there are different characteristics, but the main difference between angel investing and VC, which is the next form, venture capitalist, is that as angel investors, we invest our own money. So it's our own hard-earned money, and we're a lot more cautious, and we take the biggest risks because we get in very early into a startup's journey. VC funds invest other people's money. There's an increasing blur in the lines now because VC funds are prepared to come in earlier so that they can steer the way in which the direction startups go. So you're seeing VC funds come in earlier, but generally they don't tend to come in until you've created a minimum viable product, you've got a product market fit, and you've got some revenue coming in. So those are the main differences between angel investing and VCs.
Thank you for that thorough analysis. I think you scared a lot of us away from it. It's a huge risk. And as you said, you're investing all of your money. With that risk, Isabel, can I ask, do you get an emotional attachment to some of these business, or is that even riskier? Do you purely see it from a financial and economic standpoint?
So I'll say both. I will say having an emotional connection So for me, emotional intelligence is important.
Yeah.
So the relationship management aspect of it, I think it's crucial. So having a good working relationship with a person that you're planning to invest in or an entrepreneur, I think it's very important. But obviously, that's not the only reason. You don't just invest in a startup because you like the entrepreneur. The idea has to be viable. It has to be a viable commercial idea. So I'll say a mixture of both.
It's interesting. And one of the reasons why I wanted to ask to have your opinion on that, because that leads into my next question, because an emotional attachment or bias is pretty much a hot topic right now. Not as much here as it is in America, but according to a Harvard study between 1990 and 2016, just 0.4% of the entrepreneurs who received a venture capitalist funding were black. That's just 188 black entrepreneurs versus 34,000 white entrepreneurs. What's your opinion about access to funding for blacks?
So I think when you're reading statistics and you're using statistics, you need to be careful to see the big picture. So what is that sample size in comparison to how many black people are actually in that space? But yes, there is a huge problem. We feel, and more we are beginning to see that people work in systems. They build systems for good reason, particularly in investing. You build systems to de-risk your investments. And therefore, those systems, unfortunately, are not favorable to black entrepreneurs. And what we need to really think about is how can we either break down those systems or build our own systems that take into consideration black entrepreneurs. And in doing so, two things I think really need to happen. The first one is the existing frameworks or in the existing systems. Investors within that system need to get out of their comfort zone and try and look for black entrepreneurs, because really I am a firm believer of capital knows no color. People might feel that's a bit naive, but I can guarantee you if I get returns from my investment, I will go where those returns come from. What we also need to be doing on the other side is promoting a lot of very good entrepreneurs that are not necessarily in the ecosystems that have been built. So we need to make more of an effort to promote these ecosystems, promote these entrepreneurs. And part of one of the things we're doing in Diaspora Angel is actually just doing that. It's not so much as investing in new entrepreneurs, but actually promoting existing ones that are doing good things on the continent, so that people are aware that these things are actually happening. And the more promotion you make, the more promotion you make, the more people invest, the more people are aware actually before they actually go in and invest. So I think that's quite important. Promoting what is being done on the continent is very important, and for black founders in the UK as well.
Absolutely, it's so important. I can't believe we're already running out of time, but I've got to ask a little bit more about the Diaspora Angels Network. I know that you help with African entrepreneurs and startups there. Is it very competitive? I know that already we've got the Silicon Valley giants desperately scrambling to build as much as they can on Africa. Do you feel that perhaps sometimes, angels like yourselves or other smaller type of VCs can be outshined by these bigger dollar guys?
Well, the fascinating thing for us is that angel investing is about two things: money and mentorship, and they go hand in hand. So whilst the foreign investors can come with a lot of money, and we agree to that, but there is a mentorship aspect to that, and I think people on ground, actually people from those communities, are the best to mentor those entrepreneurs. So we've got an advantage actually, and that's one of the reasons why the Diaspora Angel Network, our investment strategy is to co-invest with local angel investors, co-invest with local VC firms, co-invest with local incubation hubs, because we believe that mentorship aspect is really what's going to drive that business idea, or that's what's really going to make that business successful.
Jared and Isabel, Alyssa, Asher, founders of the Diaspora Angel Network. Thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global. It was short but really important because you're championing startups, and that's exceptionally important on the continent. Thank you so much. Sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channels Business Global. Goodbye.